Today we're going to talk about the less is more principle. Now, every really good mix has contrast. It has relativity. You got to have things that are more background, that are more subtle, to make the more in-your-face and forward things have the contrast. It makes them more impactful. So today we're going to talk about 3 tips where you can employ the less is more principle and make the most of your mix. A mix needs to be exciting and it needs to have dimension. A great mix has a lot of dimension, and not just width and depth, but it has variations in volume, in density, and in transients. Like I said, if everything is to the max, then nothing is to the max because you've lost the contrast. So less is more. And where you decide to have more or less makes a big difference, because we want to maintain that dimension and keep it interesting. So tip number 1 is using just the right amount of transients in your mix. In the context of the mix, a lot of times you might find that you can get away with less transients on a lot of things than you might realize, and that opens up the mix and gives it more space. If you're in a hard genre and you have a loud, fast, aggressive song, then all of these examples are going to be even more apparent. But today we're going to use a really gentle, spacious, ambient song so you can see that this really does apply to all genres. So here's our drum bus compression. And here's the A-B comparison here. So this first one has a relatively fast attack and slow release. And then the B version has the threshold engaged a little further with an even faster attack and slower release. And that sounds like this. And here's this guitar pad sound here. Now let's turn on a transient shaper here. And here we've just simply taken out a bunch of the transient. Bypass. Back on. It really pushes the sound further to the background. And same thing on this other guitar that's just playing chords. Let's listen to that with the transient shaper taking out the transient. Again, this pushes it way to the background. But the body of the waveform, the sustain and the decay part of the wave is the same. So the overall volume is really similar. So now let's listen to this mix with these 2 transient shapers turned on and then off, and then with the drum bus compression, letting more transient through and then less. And listen to the vocals and the saxophone and how much more space they have when we have reduced the transients and use less transients in this mix.
If you're looking for change, he don't live here anymore. Oh no. If you're looking for change, he don't live here anymore.
See, do we really need all those extra transients? We can still hear all of those sounds just fine, but we've given the mix a lot more space. And the vocalist and the saxophone sound more up front, even though we haven't changed them at all. So that's just a less is more principle with transients. Let's listen to it one more time.
If you're looking for change, he don't live here anymore. He left the other day. He don't live here. Anymore.
So as you can hear, you can probably get away with less transients than you might think if you listen to the whole mix and just start to dial them back and see what is too far in the background and make your decisions about how much you actually need. This is something that a lot of mixers just simply overlook. So do you really need everything to be so snappy and punchy? Now, we control transients with attack times on compressors and with transient shapers, but don't forget you can also automate any of these settings. So say you do something similar where you have less transients during a verse, but then you bring them back for the chorus. That can give you a lot of impact that you can't necessarily get with volume automation. And you can kind of use the transients as a kind of emphasis or de-emphasis for the amount of forwardness or backwardness in your mix. And all of that is creating dimension. And that brings us to tip number 2, which is using saturation strategically. Now, saturation also affects your transients because it kind of acts as a clipper or compressor on the peak of the waveform. So when you're using saturation, you want to keep tip number 1 in mind because it will affect your transients. But on top of that, what saturation does is it adds harmonics into the waveform and makes it fuller. And anything that you put saturation on in your mix is in of itself going to sound better. It's going to make it fuller. It's going to make it a little more compressed. Saturation on any one thing sounds great. But just like overcompression, oversaturation can also be a big problem. It can muddy up your mix and it can also ruin your contrast. If everything is oversaturated, then you've lost the dimension that you could gain by just saturating strategic things. So let's take a listen again to this mix with more saturation and less saturation. This way you'll be able to just hear what happens when you get too carried away with saturation and not use it strategically. And then here's an example of just strategic saturation, leaving the background stuff that is already full enough alone and using saturation to really thicken up the things in the foreground. This is just one way to do it, but take a listen to the difference. Yeah, so as you can hear, you don't want to get too carried away with saturation either. And you want to use it strategically. You want to put it on the things that really need it, and you want to make sure that you leave some things a little thinner, a little less full, because you want to maintain that contrast. And now for tip number 3, another thing that I want to point out is how much of everything do you really need? So many stems with so many instruments and samples and everything. Do you really need all of it all of the time? Now, your client might be resistant to you removing some of what they gave you, but if it's opening up the mix, they might see that it actually sounds better. You know, for example, is there a point in a verse in a song where you can simply leave something out altogether or turn it way into the background to where you can barely hear it? And if you can, do you actually really need it? You know, is it a piano or a rhythm guitar where you need both all the time? Or can you get away with just one and maybe bring the other one back in during the pre-chorus? Does the shaker need to be going constantly, or are there parts in the first half of a verse where you can mute it? Things like that. How many things can you actually take out of the mix to open up and give space and contrast? That way, when those sounds come back in the mix, they're more impactful and they mean more, and the listener hasn't just gotten fatigued listening to them constantly or learned to tune them out. Does it really need to be there all the time? I think you'll find that a lot of things don't. even acoustic guitars that might just be strumming chords. Do you need that constantly, or are there times where you can remove it? What can you mute or get rid of, and how often? Because all of that will make the mix more interesting when you have certain times where there's less things and then they come back. And all of it will add contrast to your mix instead of having everything going all of the time. So just all good things to think about. We want to keep this principle in mind to get a good mix, to keep it interesting, and to keep it dynamic. Yes, we want to be able to make the most of a sound if need be. A big full vocal is important. A really big drum kit is really important. But how often do you need everything to be ginormous all of the time? Any song in any genre, you need some variation, and that involves contrast. So what can you dial back or get rid of? Well, I hope you like that. Thanks for tuning in, and I want to say thank you and welcome to all of my new subscribers. It's been a while since I've made a video. I've been very busy at Tower Station recording, and I've been very busy over on Patreon. And on that note, we do a Q&A every week, and we're doing mix contests, and there's a lot of extra great material over there. So if you were to join now, for $5 a month, you could catch up on a year's worth of material, and then you could get involved in the conversation and get involved in the next mix contest. And that is a really great way to take your mixing skills to the next level and get involved in a community that's engaged, where people are asking questions and chiming in, and it's really great stuff that's going on over there. So thank you to all my Patreons, and thanks again, everybody. Happy mixing. See you all soon.